In the context of land disputes, you will also often need to look at the question of dispossession. Very often in conflict environments, you'll have had periods where large numbers of people have been dispossessed of their land one way or another. And after, maybe during the peace negotiations already, or maybe after, there will be a demand of these people to get some sort of justice for what has happened to them. Of course, one element that is very important is this a protracted situation? Have these been violations that go in over 20, 30, 40 years? Or have these been short-term violations? The latter, an example, it was Bosnia, or the former, an example that where violations have gone on over decades is, of course, Colombia. Now, the international policy making on this has been preoccupied by this issue of dispossession and has proposed or has usually taken a rights-based approach, been adopted with a focus on remedies for dispossession and the remedy focusing particularly on one remedy and the remedy of land restitution. When you look at elements or when you look at policy documents like the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, we look at the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to Remedy, the Principles on Housing and Property Restitution for Refugees and IDPs. You see that the focus in dispossession has been how can we undo the dispossession that has happened by focusing on land restitution. What are some of the other dispossession responses that we could give? And I'll go then afterwards into each of them for a little while. Restitution is one of them, sometimes linked with return, and in Bosnia, restitution was very much seen initially as a means to encourage return. It was actually the main objective was return of population and undoing ethnic cleansing. I think now there's increasingly a disconnection, and rightly so, between the two, in that the fact that you restitute property does not necessarily or automatically either trigger return or doesn't necessarily require return. The second option is compensation. The third option is alternative property. And the last option is what I would call resignation, which is at some point people give up their claim and say, okay, nothing is going to happen and we move on with our lives, which of course is not necessarily a solution that we want to promote. One of the dilemmas that one faces after periods of dispossession, I think this applies particularly in situations where there's been protected periods of dispossession, where dispossession has occurred over a number of years or decades, and less so when you talk about short-term dispossession, where putting things back together is often much easier, or at least much less difficult, is whether you take a retrospective approach or whether you take a prospective approach. A retrospective approach is looking back and say, okay, there is 120,000 people out there that used to live in the countryside. They have now, most of them, been forcibly, or they had to move to urban areas. They lost their land. Often they had to move because of the land was grabbed from them. We are now going to reconstruct the relations that these people had with the land, and we are going to give them the land back that they lost. Of course, if this is exactly what people want, then the discussion ideally should be moot. If this is what displaced people want, if this is what the dispossessed people want, then of course restitution is the best way forward. However, a retrospective approach has two potential downsides. First, the question is whether it's a practicable solution, whether it is possible after 30 or 40 years to go through a process of 140, 150,000 land restitution claims within a time frame that is relevant and reasonable for the people that have lost their rights. Secondly, the issue is it really what the people who lost their rights still want? Because very often when people have moved, for example, from rural to urban areas, people will have changed their lifestyles. People, especially the younger people, are not interested in going back. But maybe more fundamentally, and the restitution also presumes that the situation before the conflict was a good situation to go back to. And let me give you an example. When in 2004 the Property Claims Commission was established in Iraq, it was established to deal with real violations of land issues that had taken place under Saddam. And the idea was to take a fully rights-based approach whereby the people that lost land rights under Saddam, for example in the north of Iraq, through the Arabization process, they would lose their land rights, they would be given compensation, and the people that lost the land rights, they would be given the land back. there was never a discussion whether the land rights situation before Saddam clearly did his illegal land takings was an ideal situation to go back to. And in some of the micro research that we did in some of the communities, we realized that applying a pure land restitution based approach in this context would mean reducing the number of land rights holders from 5,000 to 2. Now, is that a good idea or is that not a good idea? It's not necessarily up to us as the international community to pronounce ourselves whether it's a good idea or not, or at least not to promote one idea over the other, but at least we should be the ones, rather than ideologically almost clinging on to land restitution as being the best solution, we should also be the ones in alerting, saying, hold on a minute, was the earlier situation a viable situation to go back to, looking forward for the new society that you are trying to build. Fourthly, when you think about it, if land issues were part of what, which is not always the case, what started or drove the conflict, is it wise to go back to the situation that caused the conflict to begin with? Or are other changes required, or more fundamentally structural changes required to avoid a relapse into conflict? Again, there is no, there shouldn't be an anti-restitution bias either, but it is important to highlight that there are some problems with land restitution as well. So in addition to this, or in addition to, or to this retrospective approach, you can also take a more prospective approach and say, look at, for example, more traditional forms of distributive land reform. Is the transitional moment a good moment to talk about land reform? For example, when you look at Colombia, where in a number of surveys, IDPs, internally displaced people, have expressed preference for staying in the urban areas where they are, should the way forward be to do land reform to the extent to give those people better access to property in the urban areas where they are today, increase their land tenure security, improve the quality of their houses, or should the focus be on trying to give them back their land in the rural areas? I do not want to pronounce myself here on this question, but it is important to have that sort of debate and to look forward as well as backward and say, it's not enough to say this person lost property, we have 150,000 people that lost property, therefore we need to restitute that and we need to return to the situation before. That needs to be complemented with a prospective view as to what is it that people want today and what is the type of society that we want to create. So let me summarize the issue on restitution. So restitution can be a good solution and restitution can be a good remedy, but it can be questionable if there is no pre-conflict status that is good enough to go back to, if you like. If there has been excessive passage of time since dispossession, which really then becomes an issue of practicability, when, for example, the land use may have changed in such a fundamental way that it cannot be given back to the population or the people that lost it. It also has an issue in conflicts where a lot of the victims of dispossession had no legal rights to begin with. If you were, or let me put it differently, restitution needs to be carefully thought about when a lot of the people that were dispossessed at the time were at best squatters, for example. What do you do with those people? Or do you only focus on maybe the small number of people or the proportionally small number of people that had formal land rights? So these are some of the issues I think that one need to look at when you look at land restitution. The second measure, and it's much less favored, I think, in the international policy documents, is financial compensation. And it's often in the guiding principles that I mentioned already, there is a sort of almost the impossibility standard. It's only something that can be done when restitution is impossible. Interestingly enough, in my experience, especially in protracted situations, financial compensation is often what people actually want. Financial compensation has one advantage. It's usually something that can be implemented relatively quickly, and it's something that people receive, and people can then do what they themselves believe is best with the money in terms of improving their life, reconstructing their livelihood, reconstructing their houses, getting better housing access, and so on. There is a bit of a bias because there is a lot of suspicion, and I think the literature on this is interesting to look at because there's a lot of variety of experiences with giving cash grants, going from really bad experiences to much better experiences. But there is a bit of a bias often, especially when the populations that are involved are relatively poor population, that you say, well, but if you give people compensation, they're not going to use it for land purchase, they're not going to use it for housing purchase, they're going to use it for consumables. Some of it, I think, is sometimes a little bit of middle-class bias of policymakers, but it's something that needs to be looked at, certainly, but that doesn't necessarily apply, and that can be, I think, mitigated, that risk, by accompanying it with financial management courses, household-level financial management courses, and so on. But compensation can be a valuable measure to deal with land dispossession. The question of funding is a real one, but the question of funding of land restitution is a real one as well. It's very difficult to see how land restitution can operate without some sort of compensation component in it in any case. The question, some of the difficult questions that come with compensation is the question about compensation on what property value. Especially when you are in a situation of a transitional situation where you have rapidly rising land and property values, what property values do you actually give, or what is the value that you give people compensation on so that people would accept what you're doing? And one example is in Iraq, for example. The people who got compensation early on in 2006, they refiled claims in 2010, 2011 because the property prices has gone up so much that they claimed that actually they never had gotten justice, but they had gotten more injustice because they never benefited from those increasing prices. It's an anecdotal example, but it shows what some of the issues are around identifying what value compensation should be paid. Again, the fiscal implications are there, and that is something that needs to be looked at carefully in the context. One of the concerns in Iraq, for example, is that there is never any assessment done on what the overall compensation bill would be for the Iraqi government, for the Property Claims Commission. Because in Iraq, the way it works is that the people who lose out through land restitution receive compensation, and most of this compensation is paid for by the Iraqi state. And there is the issue of the durable solution that I already mentioned. If you give cash to people, how are they going to use it? But I think compensation is a valuable tool in the toolbox of dealing with dispossession of land and property that we need to look at more seriously. The third alternative is, or the third possible way of dealing with dispossession is giving people alternative land and property. And I think it's important not to confuse alternative land and property with relocation. Giving people rights to alternative land and property may simply mean giving them the right to the piece of land to which they were displaced to, which doesn't involve relocation. For example, in Haiti, some of the smaller camps that appeared after the earthquake are now being regularized and integrated into the neighborhoods, and the people that are in those tents, they are given that piece of land, and whether it's that they pay for it or that's another issue, but it's an alternative land and property for them, because before the earthquake they were living elsewhere, but it does not involve relocation. So we shouldn't confuse a discussion between alternative land and property and a discussion on relocation. Of course, is alternative land available? Very often that is not the case, and it has to be not any alternative land. It has to be land that is actually attractive to the people that you're giving it to. A little bit of an anecdotal example is the Yemen Land Commission, which has the possibility of giving alternative land. And my understanding is that they have been giving to people who lost some beachfront properties in the south of Yemen, they've been giving them desert land as alternative land. And it's obvious that that is not real alternative land, because there is no infrastructure, there's no water, there's no electricity, and there's not a lot of enthusiasm, as you can imagine, amongst claimants for this alternative land. Is there access to services in this alternative land so that people can use it? Is there economic activity so that people will want to stay? These are all questions that need to be asked. And one important question is, of course, when you look at alternative land, what about the prior rights holders to this particular alternative land? Very often governments will find it very difficult in transitional periods to tell you exactly what land belongs to them, for example. And even if governments tell you that this is public land, you often need to be suspicious and apply a due diligence standard to make sure that there aren't communities out there, aren't families out there that have quite a different view as to who this land is belonging to.